Mihály Babits, as Laci mentioned, was an important author of Hungarian literary modernity in the first half of the 20th century. The history of the Babits research group goes back to the 1980s. Tibor Kronicai, the director of the Institute for Literary Studies at the time, urged the publication of critical editions, so he supported the idea of launching the textological research on Babits works. Later, the work of the research group was shared between two independent groups. According to their agreement, the research group based at the Institute for Literary Studies is responsible for the critical edition of Babits poems, while the other research group based at the Department of Modern Hungarian Literature at the Eötvös Loránd University edits all other texts of various genres. Currently, this research group is based at the Catholic University. Given the nature of the research, it is to emphasize the importance of the interinstitutional cooperation. Most of the manuscripts of Babits can be found in three archives: the National Széchenyi Library, the Petőfi Literary Museum, and the archives of Hungarian Academy of Sciences. These three institutions were charged with cataloging and ordering the manuscripts, but they also undertook the bibliographic processing of the entire work. Their output manifested in the publication of catalog of Babits manuscript heritage in four volumes and Babits bibliography. Working within the research group allocated to the Institute for Literary Studies, Judith Rona compiled a biographical chronology of Babits. These very important preliminary works were indispensable before starting the critical edition. The first volume of critical edition of Babits poetry was published 5 years ago, covering the poems written up to 1905, and the second volume, poems from 1906 to 1910, is due to publish by the end of this year. These volumes have been prepared using the traditional textological method and publish the poems in printed forms. As the Babits legacy from 1910s contains many autograph fragments, draft texts, handwritten and typed fair copies, as well as in many cases of duplicate publications. So from the third volume, we must change our methodology. On the one hand, this means applying the principle of genetic criticism to the method of processing and publishing manuscripts, and on the other hand, giving the priority to the online publication of works. While we are preparing the digital editions of the first two volumes, starting with the third volume, researchers working on the Babits critical editions prepare the print and digital text editions in the same workflow, the result of which will be the text presented in the two media. During the digital philological processing of the work, the traditional textologist competencies must be complemented by theoretical and practical new media skills. And it also requires us to cooperate closely with experts of digital philology and informatics. The Babits research group currently consists of 10 researchers, including both traditional philologists, like me, with in-depth knowledge of Babits work, maybe, and young researcher using new digital philological methods. The digital humanities background of the research group is provided by the DBPhil project. The IT development take place in the Digital Heritage for National Laboratory in cooperation with Ötvös Loránd University, the University of Miskolc, the National Archives of Hungary, and the Research Center for Humanities. The critical edition is currently being prepared with the support of National Research Development and Innovation Office. This was my part, and Anita, please continue the presentation.
Thank you, Zoli. And I would like to continue the presentation with the network of Hungarian war poems and the digital philological possibility of Mihály Babits war poems. Firstly, I would like to speak about the characteristic of the digital edition of poems of Mihály Babits. Similar to the traditional critical editions, digital critical editions are not without philological tasks and problems, such as the dating and attribution of poems and fragments, search and registration of unknown variation and fragments, and description of the text. In addition to these tasks, writing to explanatory notes of the edition and the critical apparatus, as well as the explanation of the history of works, are also the duty of the research. The work of the critical edition, however, is linked to the digital working environment itself. The DigiField service provides a suitable environment framework for this edition and an open space for the scholarly publication of the text variants, for the presentation of the characteristic, for the description of the interconnections, and for the literary history of the material to be processed. To create a research environment, the DigiField uses Oxygen XML editor, which provides the technical features that are essential for a fast and stable working environment. During the specification process, the features that appear in each version, such as the writing tool, the direction, or the scope of correction and insertion, are implemented into a digital environment. Extensible markup language has become the commonly used markup language in the line with the Text Encoding Initiative recommendation. So in each edition, DigiField staff develops a framework, a digital background working environment, appropriate to the text corpus in which XML is able to meet both and traditional philological and the digital challenges precisely. Okay. In the digital critical edition, we can read synoptically the version of the text, show how the poems evolve, and genetic criticism can help us interpret the poems too. During the digital processing of the text, the typescriber defines their location, the condition and properties of the manuscripts and typescripts, the number and the location of variants, the list of the text, and the specific feature of the sources, dating, attribution, text boundaries, description of the manuscript, and the bibliographic data. In addition to the publication and interrelationship of the text variants, the history of their origin should be an integral part of the text and groups of the text. In the case of a single poem, the encoding of textual variants, the visualization of correction, and insertion does not merely show the changes in the manuscripts over time and the history of their creation on a screen, but also allow, for example, for the interpretative possibilities arising from the process of the text formation. And now, I would like to examine the exact philological problem of war poems. So the first word war is usually interpreted as the first mass war, and its impacts not only historical and political, but also significant from a point of view of literary history. In the years following of outbreak of the war, thousands of Hungarian poems and prose works are born that chose the word war as their theme. Mihály Babits published his Young Soldier and Our Father In a war anthologies, his criticism of war propaganda and war rhetoric is, in many ways, an essential element of his poetry of the time. Thus, the First World War is not merely the theme of Babits poems, but can also be interpreted as a network of forms and mode of speech. The First World War as a network can therefore be understood from several perspectives of Babits poetry. On the one hand, we can find this theme in the terms of poetic modes of speech and forms evoked in the war poems, and on the other hand, we can speak about the poet's traditional roles. As a result, the question arises, to what extent the long 19th century, understood from the perspective of Hungarian national traditionalism, is opposed to literary modernity in connection with the war. How to the war, the Hungarian war poetry shaped the characteristics of Babits poems, and how Babits poetry changed continuously until the Fortissimo. The presentation introduced the related names and the network of the literary field, examined the present relationship of Babits published war poems and unpublished manuscripts, as well as demonstrate the possible relationship between the poem in the war anthologies and Babits poems in the digital critical editions. Now, Ágos Gyulai's book, titled War Anthology, was published in 1916. In his collection, he published hundreds of World War poems, for example, folk songs, and work of Szénási, but poem of Dezső Kosztolányi and Mihály Babits are also included in the collection. The volume was organized in thematic order. The war poems were arranged according to various themes, such as alarm and campfire and death and so on. I would like to show some examples. For example, a poem of Magyari Lajos. I'm sorry for the translation, I'm not a poet. Another example of Árpád Zempléni, the writer of Tyrannic Song. It is a political stuff in Hungarian poetry. These poems basically characterized by wartime enthusiasm or maybe a wartime romanticism. In addition, there are many battle songs in the war anthology use the theme of revenge and the justice and the heroism of the central issue of the war poems. Yes, we can see that poems are naive and anachronistic a little bit, but at the same time we have to see that these poems follow traditional models of martial poetry. Babits included these poems in their own poem war anthologies, and we can present in the history of the poem's genesis, or if all the texts will be available digitally, we can show the connection between the war poems and Babits' work. Of course, the exact definition and networking of the names and poets and editors will contribute to this, so it will be very exciting, for example, to examine what kind of people appeared in Ágos Gyulai's volume. The next, what we do when not only the content of the poems is similar, but also the forms. Many poems use a form of prayer, but in this case the prayer is more like a curse, wished upon a very enemy, asking the gods destroy their enemies. Very often the Lord of Hosts formula appears, but it is mostly used the sense of a destroying God, the God as a Lord Commander, yes, by the authors of the poems. Fortissimo is also very much related to text, and it confronts their image of God and their poetic tradition in general. It is known that Babits was sued for Fortissimo, accused of blasphemy, but it's perhaps worth pointing out that Babits created Fortissimo using the psalm tradition and using a poetic form, namely the psalms and the dithyrambic forms in which the individual speaking up for the community is depicted. Lastly, it is worth mentioning that several fragments are textually connected to poems, especially, as Zoltán Szénási has shown, several fragments are connected to a Before Easter poem. The first half of the first line of fragment, titled Dicséri a második Eztest, correspond to line 56 of the poem Húsvét előtt. The second half of the first line and the second line to line 61 and 62 of Before Easter. As we can see on the slide, it is possible to precisely mark this textual link between the poems and fragments. Since the critical edition will also present fragment examine their intertextual link. So this project is not over, and we would like to realize the possibility of the digital critical editions. And thank you very much.